this video, we are going to learn the 2 to 4 player game Almanac, The Dragon Road, designed by Scott Almes and published by Kolossal Games. In Almanac, players will assume the role of a traveling caravan traveling down the treacherous Dragon Road to reach the Dragon City. Once the Dragon City has been reached, the player who has collected the most money or the most fame will be the overall winner of the game. Let's take a look at setup and gameplay. To begin setup, place the Almanac in the center of the table where all players can reach it and open it to the first location, the outpost. Each player will then select a color and will receive a player screen, 3 workers, both in the color of their choice, as well as a starting wagon. The starting wagons will grant them their starting workers, in this case 3, and a total strength. In this case, at the start of the game, each player will begin with 1 strength in their caravan. The youngest player at the table will be given the compass. This indicates that they will be the first player for the start of the game and will be referred to as the guide for the starting round. Players are then given an amount of gold based on their turn order. Player 1 will receive 10 gold. Player 2 will receive 12 gold. In a 3-player game, the third player would receive 14 gold, and if we had a 4th player, that player would receive 16 gold. For the purposes of this How to Play video, we're going to be setting up for a 2-player game, and the player screens that we showed previously are going to be kept off camera. Players should keep their gold at all times behind their player screen so that their opponents do not know how much gold they have. Shuffle the caravan deck and place it next to the board. Do the same with the contract deck. These decks will be used throughout the game for the players to add wagons to their caravan, as well as collecting contracts that they will use throughout the course of the game to score fame. You will also place 2 dice next to the Almanac. We have a 6-sided die, a standard 6-sided die that will be used for certain locations as well as some encounters, as well as a fight die that can be used during encounters. Create a supply of gold tokens and place those near the Almanac. You will have piles for denominations of 1 gold, 5 gold, 20 gold, and 50 gold. Also, create a supply of guard tokens near the board. These guard tokens will be acquired throughout various means as the game goes along, and each guard token will add additional strength to a player's caravan. Separate the 4 resources by type and place supplies of each next to the Almanac within reach of all players. You will have resource piles for skyfish, ember spice, dew leaf, and Everice. In the box, you will find 5 different encounter decks. There will be an encounter deck for A, an encounter B deck, encounter C, encounter D, and encounter E. During setup, you will take 1 encounter from each of the 5 decks and arrange them into a single encounter deck with encounter A on top. The remaining encounters will be alphabetized all the way through to encounter E and stacked in that order. All unused encounters can be returned to the box. Now that setup is complete, we are ready to discuss gameplay and how the game is played. Through the course of the game, players are going to explore 6 different locations in total, each of which will consist of 1 game round. These locations are also found throughout the pages of the Almanac. Players will start at the outpost in every single game, but then will decide which path to take in order to reach Dragon City. Each location or page within the Almanac will provide players with a unique challenge to overcome in pursuit of their goals of earning fame throughout the realm. Many locations will have pieces that are specific to that location or page, some of which will provide special abilities throughout the remainder of the game, or will be kept by the players until the end of the game for endgame scoring. The player who best overcomes these challenges by acquiring wealth, building their caravan, completing contracts, and performing these adventurous deeds will become the most famed merchant in the realm and the winner of the game. Almanac consists of 6 game rounds, each taking place on a different location or page within the Almanac, and each consisting of 3 phases: the arrival phase, the action phase, and the end phase. Players enter a new location each time they turn to a new page in the Almanac. Every time a new location is entered, the first phase is the arrival phase. During the arrival phase, in turn order, each player will resolve any enter a new location effects that they have in their play area. These would come from contracts that have been completed previous to this particular arrival phase. We will also deal out a number of wagon cards equal to the number of players from the caravan deck, and they will get placed face up next to the Almanac. Let's take a quick look at one of these wagon cards. A wagon card consists of a new wagon that you can add to your party. Adding a new wagon provides a few things. First of all, you're given additional spaces to hold resources. Each crate is a space that will hold resources, so this particular wagon will hold 3 additional resources. It also could potentially add strength to your caravan, give you an additional worker, and provide fame points at the end of the game. We'll discuss purchasing wagons a little further along in the video. The final step of the arrival phase is to read the location-specific lore as well as setup and placement rules so that all players can hear and know how this particular location is played. Any additional components that are required for the particular location are retrieved from the box and will be set up according to that location's instructions. In the case of this first location, the outpost, there is a placement rule. The placement rule is that players can only place one of their workers in each of the 4 guild huts depicted on the map. So we see guild huts here. There are 4 different guild huts on this outpost map. A player can have at most one of their workers in each hut. With the arrival phase complete, we now enter the action phase. Each location will be resolved in a similar manner, even though the locations themselves and the rules associated with them will differ. Starting with the guide, or the first player, each player will place one worker at a time and resolve the space on which they placed their worker. If on a player's turn they can no longer place a worker, they are simply skipped and play will proceed to the next player in turn order. This will continue until every player at the table has placed all of their available workers. After all players have placed their workers and resolved their actions, we will proceed to the end phase. The end phase is made up of a few different steps. If this was the final location in the game and the action phase had been completed and no remaining destination options are available, then we would proceed to end of game scoring. Otherwise, the end phase consists of the following steps. First, players will bid to be the new guide, and the compass will be given to the player who makes the winning bid. Bidding for the guide is done by players taking a secret amount of gold into their hands, whatever amount they wish to bid. Once all players are ready, they will reveal the gold that is held in their hand. The player who bid the most gold becomes the guide and will take the compass to indicate that they are the guide or the first player for the next location. They will pay an amount of gold equal to the least amount of gold that was bid. So whichever player bid the least amount of gold to a minimum of 1, that is the amount of gold that the new guide will now pay. If in the unlikely event all players bid 0 gold, the guide will win the tie and will pay no gold into the supply and will remain the guide for the following turn. If there is a tie for highest bid, then the player who has the compass and is the current guide, or who is most closely seated to the current guide, will win the bid and win the compass and become the new guide in that player. Once the bidding is complete, the guide will choose the next location from the 2 available options listed on the map. At the bottom of the page on the outpost, and on every location page, there are 2 locations listed that will give you a breakdown of the resources, which resources are most valuable, and which ones are the most in supply at each location, as well as the page number that you will turn to. The guide will select from the 2 available locations, and play will proceed to that page for the next round. Once a new location has been selected, you will reveal and resolve the top encounter card. So for leaving the outpost, we will resolve the top encounter card, which is Encounter A, off of the encounter deck that we created earlier. These encounters could be special events where you encounter someone along the road, or some kind of fight that you may get into that would require you to fight and compare your caravan strength to the strength of a different enemy or something that you've encountered along the road. Once the encounter card has been resolved, we then enter the cleanup for the end phase, where players will retrieve all of their workers, discard any unpurchased wagons next to the caravan deck. The page will be turned to the chosen location, and we will proceed to the next arrival phase. Let's take a look in depth at the action phase and the different spaces that are available to players. Each location is made up of a series of spaces that provides standard actions to the players. The standard actions will be found on most, if not all, pages in the Almanac. There are also locations within the Almanac that will have their own special spaces, and the rules for those spaces will be explained on the location setup page, which is always to the left side of the location. Looking at the spaces here, you first have a space that allows you to gain goods or gain resources. Gaining goods simply allows you to place a worker on any space that has a series of icons on it. So if I were to take a worker and place it on this space, this worker would gain these two resources, in this case a dew leaf and an ember spice. They would simply take those from the supply and add them to their wagon. The wagon on their caravan, and any wagons they add to their caravan, will have a pictured number of crates being carried by that wagon. This will determine the number of goods that each player can hold in their caravan. At the start of the game, the player's starting wagon can hold a maximum of 6 goods. If when gaining goods a player would exceed the number of maximum goods, they can reorganize the goods in any way they wish and discard down to their maximum number at the end of the turn after they collect goods. Alternatively, a player can move to a sell goods space. The spaces here will indicate which good is being sold, as well as a dollar amount or an amount in gold that the player would receive for selling goods of that type. So placing a worker on this space, for example, would allow this player to sell any number of skyfish goods that they've collected previously for a cost of 3 gold apiece. So if they sold 3 skyfish, they would gain 9 gold in return. The Stamp a Contract space allows a player to complete one of the contracts that they were dealt at the beginning of the game. At the start of the game, each player is dealt 2 random contracts from the contract deck. They also have the capability in future locations of collecting new contracts that they could then complete for ongoing effects, special abilities, as well as end-game points. It's important to point out that with contracts, any completed contracts will add fame to your end-game score, while any uncompleted contracts will subtract that fame away. This is an example of a contract card. This would be a card that is kept face down and secret from other players, and then once completed is flipped face up, and you then get some kind of special ability as well as some end game points. In the case of the Mountain Peak Catchers Guild that we see here on the screen, in order to complete this contract, the player would need to return to the supply 2 dew leaf goods as well as 1 ember spice. So 2 green and a red, if you will. Once the contract is completed, it's placed face up in that player's play area, and they now have the ongoing ability. In this case, they may substitute 2 skyfish for 1 good of any other type. They may do this for the remainder of the game and as many times as they wish. At the end of the game, this completed contract will add 18 fame to the player's final score. If at the end of the game this contract were not completed, it would cost the player 18 fame. Purchasing wagons. To purchase a wagon, a player will place their worker on the Purchase a Wagon space, this little wagon wheel with some extra colors in it. When purchasing a wagon, the player will return to the supply the resources listed on the cost of that wagon, as well as the number of gold required to purchase the wagon. That wagon is then added to their caravan, and any new workers that it grants are added immediately to the player's supply of available workers, meaning that those new workers would become available for use during the current round. The wagon card shown on screen is being shown as an example of a wagon that could be purchased. During the game, there will always be at each location a number of wagons available to be purchased that is equal to the number of players. So in our 2-player game, every location will have 2 wagons available. If the orange player elects to go to this wagon space and wishes to purchase a wagon, to purchase the wagon on camera, they would need to return 2 skyfish to the supply and pay 6 gold, also back to the supply. They would then gain this wagon and add it to their caravan, placing it next to their starting wagon. This particular wagon will add 2 more spaces for holding goods, as pictured by the 2 additional crates in this wagon. It also adds 2 strength to this player's caravan, an additional worker, which they would immediately gain and have available to them, And at the end of the game, this particular wagon will be worth 7 fame. Players also have the option to visit the shop. If they choose to visit the shop, they will place their meeple on the door space, place their worker on the door space, and then they have the option of doing one of 3 things. They can either gain 1 of any good that they wish, they can sell any number of a single good for 3 gold apiece, or they can gain a guard token. Guard tokens are very valuable over the course of the game because they make it easier for you to accomplish successfully the different encounters or fights that you may come across as the game progresses. Every guard token that you acquire will stay in your play area and will add 1 strength to your caravan's total strength for the purposes of resolving fights along the way. Each location has a page dedicated to the lore of that specific location, as well as any specific placement rules, setup instructions, and the value, supply, and demand of the goods in that location. Looking at the outpost, we have a bunch of information here. First of all, you have the location number or the page number that will determine which location you're going to. So in this case, outpost is page number 1, your starting spot. You also have the name of the location, as well as the supply and demand track. The way the supply and demand track works is it shows you, of the 4 goods that you have between the Everice, the Dewleaf, the Ember Spice, and the Skyfish, which of the goods is most valuable at that particular location, meaning it's worth the most gold, as well as which one is the most in supply at the location. Reading from left to right will tell you the overall value of those particular goods. The good to the furthest to the left, in this case the Everice, is the most valuable good. That means that at that location you will get the most money for that particular good for selling it. If you read from right to left, it will tell you which good is most in abundance at that location, the most readily available. In this case, the Dewleaf is the most abundant at the outpost, followed by the Skyfish, the Ember Ice, and then most scarce at this location is of course the most valuable, the Everice. You then have placement rules. In this case, the placement rule for the outpost states that players can only place 1 of their workers in each guild hut. You may also have additional special setup rules on these pages, and that may require you to go into the box and pull out page-specific components. They will all be explained on this page, as well as the rules for interacting or using any of those components and what they do for you both during the remainder of the game as well as end-game scoring. At the bottom of the deck, or bottom of the page, you will see 2 locations. So the 2 locations that you have the option of traveling to. These are the 2 locations that the guide will choose from during our end phase to determine the next location that we move to. You also have a breakdown of the supply and demand at each of those locations. So you will see again a list of which good is worth the most gold, as well as which good is the most in supply at that particular location. This will help the guide determine the best location for their own purposes based on which goods they may have the most of in their caravan that they may be interested in selling at the new location to gain more gold. The letter down here indicates which encounter you will be facing during the end phase as you leave this particular location. At the end of the outpost, you will always be encountering the encounter A from your encounter deck. When an encounter happens, the top card of the encounter deck, which will always match the encounter letter at the bottom of the location, will be drawn and will be resolved in turn order starting with the guide. Every encounter has some lore or a story on it, so in this case there's some skyfish flying overhead, and then there's generally a choice or some kind of a fight that must happen. In this case, starting with the guide and in turn order, the guide will make their decision first, so they can either sell skyfish and gain 5 gold, the guide would gain 6 gold or 8 gold instead, or you have the option of keeping the skyfish, gaining 1 skyfish good from the supply. If you're the guide making this decision, you would gain 2 skyfish. So the guide will make their decision, and then in turn order, the other players will do the same. Some encounters may require you to fight. So in the example of this particular encounter, which is also one of the encounters you could potentially pull from A, you have to fight a dire mole. In order to fight, again, you start with the guide first. The guide will take the fight die and roll that die, adding its result to their current party's strength. The party strength, or the caravan strength, is denoted by the shield icons on all of the wagons in that player's caravan, as well as any guard tokens they have. If that total is higher than or equal to the number showing on this encounter, in the case of the dire mole, 2, then the guide would win the fight. If the guide wins the fight, they will gain 2 goods of the same type, and this encounter will immediately end, meaning that no other player will get to fight the dire mole because the guide has already defeated it. If, however, the guide rolls the die and does not have a total party strength of 2 or higher, they will lose 1 good, and they will not get to fight again for the remainder of this encounter. Play would then pass to the next player in turn order, who would get to fight, and this will continue until one player either defeats or wins the fight, or all players have lost, in which case you would simply proceed to the next encounter, or the next location. One other kind of encounter is an encounter where the guide simply makes the choice, and it's not something that's done in player order. So we previously saw the Skyfish encounter here, where each player, starting with the guide, got to make a decision and do one or the other. And so, of course, the guide could choose to take 8 gold in this case, and the player to their left could choose to gain 1 Skyfish, for example. Another type of encounter you may run into is the type of encounter that just says the guide chooses. This is where the player who currently holds the compass and is the guide gets to make the decision for the entire party. In this case, they could choose to open a scroll, which would let them roll the 6-sided die. If they roll a 1 to 3, every player would gain 6 gold. If they rolled a 4 to 6, no one gains anything. The guide could also make the choice instead to deliver the scroll. In this case, each player gaining 1 gold. So again, we could take the safe choice and just give everyone 1 gold, or we could take the chance, roll the die, and possibly gain 6 gold for every player at the table. These types of encounters are also frequent throughout the deck. So those are 3 types of encounters that you may find. You may find player encounters, where things are resolved in turn order, starting with the guide. You will find encounters where the guide simply chooses the outcome that's going to happen. And you may find fights that will happen along the way, where you have to roll the fight die and compare your party's strength to the overall strength of the encounter that you've run across. Now, while I don't want to go through every location in this book, because I want you to be surprised as you're playing the game, keep the story fresh, and not be spoilery with the different maps and the different puzzles you might run across, I did want to give you an example of one of those puzzles or one of those locations so that you can get at least a little bit of a taste of some of the variability that you may run across as you travel the Dragon Road. In this case, we are looking at location number 3, Razorbeak Canyon. Razorbeak Canyon has the special placement rules in the green bar. The placement rules determine special rules that players must abide by at this particular location when placing their workers. The placement rules at Razorbeak Canyon, state that the first worker that gets placed on each bridge, so you have 5 different bridges here, the first worker that gets placed at each of those bridges must be placed at either end of that bridge. Each additional worker placed on that bridge must then be placed in the first vacant space next to the last worker placed. So what that means is if the green player were to place a worker here, they could place either in that space or they could place in the space on this side of the board. However, from that point forward, using that bridge requires that the next worker be placed next to or adjacent to that worker that was already placed, meaning that the orange player could not come in and enter the bridge from this side. They would have to continue the trend and cross the bridge in the same direction. They could, however, choose to start another bridge location by starting at one of the other ends. In the blue bar here, there's some special setup instructions for the Razorbeak Canyon location. This says to place the tourist tokens in the designated space to the right. So this designated space on the board will be given tourist tokens. These are components that are specific to this location and are found in the box. They are labeled by location number, so they're very easy to find. In this case, we place 2 tourist tokens here, and then the special rules for those tokens. After a player places a worker on a tourist space, they gain 2 gold, take a tourist token, and add it to one of their crates. After entering each new location, players gain 2 gold for each of their tourist tokens. So, when any of the players place their worker on either of these two tourist locations on this or spaces on this location, they would get to claim a tourist location, place it in one of their crates in their caravan, and then in future locations, whenever they enter a new location, they would gain 2 gold. In addition to the 2 gold that they would take for gaining the tourist token initially, they would then gain 2 gold for the remainder of the game every time they enter a location, and that is for each tourist token. So if one player ended up with both tourist tokens, every time they entered a new location, they would be granted 4 gold. This is just an example of one of the things that you may see and one of the ways that worker placement gets changed between some of the locations. You will also notice that at the end of Razorbeak Canyon, we will take encounter B from the encounter deck and face that particular encounter, whether that is a fight, the guide choosing what we are doing for everyone, or a player, players choosing individually in turn order. At the end of the game, players will determine their final fame score, and the player with the highest fame will be the winner. If there's a tie for highest fame, the first tiebreaker is the tied player with the most money or the most gold left over. If there's still a tie, then the player who has the most resources left in their caravan or on their wagons is the tiebreaker, and if it's still tied, then the players will share the victory. To determine your final score, you will total up the number of gold that you have. So for this player, we have 49 gold that is here. Guards within the caravan do not provide any end-game points. They simply provide strength as the game goes on. You will then look at the points that are awarded on the wagons in the caravan. So we have 14 points here, 18 fame, and 10 fame for a total of 42 fame provided from our wagons. We then add in the fame awarded by the contracts that were completed throughout the course of the game. This player on screen completed 4 contracts, one for 32 fame, one for 18, one for 19, and one for 26, for a total of 95 fame points from completed contracts. However, they have an uncompleted contract down here that is worth negative 20 points. So they will remove 20 points or 20 fame from their overall total. So we'll put that down here so we remember it. There are also bonuses that can be achieved at certain locations. Some locations may allow you to acquire relics or artifacts that are worth in-game bonus fame as well as the final location. One player will be given the key to the Dragon City that is worth an additional 10 fame. I will leave it to you to see how that key to the Dragon City is awarded at each of the 2 final locations. So in this example, we have 49 gold, 42 fame from wagons, 95 fame from completed contracts, and losing 20 fame from incomplete contracts. This player has scored 166 fame, and if that was the most fame, they would be declared the winner of Almanac, the Dragon Road.